My name is Jimmy Morse, also known as James Morse in the official Publicis Sapient system. I'm an XT manager who's been with Publicis Sapient just for over a year and a half now. I reside just outside Washington, D.C., so my home office is Arlington, Virginia. I am super excited to be here for an opportunity to chat with about a product and an idea that I've been blessed enough to be involved with that has really set off an obsession around computational, generative, and parametric design. But I'm here to really talk about a tool that is in active beta that we've built internally called Theme Manager. And this sits within what best could be described as an ecosystem called Eden. Eden and Theme Manager are two things I'm super excited about, and has really opened up my eyes into the world of computational design, especially in the web format. A lot of examples for computational design is really in the architecture world, in the development world, but for the web and for applications is something that I'm very interested in, given my profession. So originally, some of the early functionality was created out of a rapid response initiative, formerly led by Adam Morse. Some early devs involved Nick Avenano, Tim Brandt, Kirat Tana. But for the last several months, I've been leading the charge on Eden development and design. Eden is not just Theme Manager. It's really an ecosystem and a methodology for approaching design and development. It's about taking advantage of the opportunity to expand on aesthetic variances within design and doing so rapidly. Because this allows us to take a subset of design assets that make the biggest difference in an aesthetic variance, which this will enable designers to rapidly explore alternative paths and really sort of look at what's possible, because even the best designers in the world have a hard time visualizing, given a set of design assets like color, fonts, and spacing, for example, how that will apply in their brain without having to explore and iterate on that. This also allows folks like sales reps to demonstrate possibilities. And sort of the role that Eden ecosystem would play is sort of pairing this and feeding this data that we're sort of creating out of these design assets into a customer data platform, and then, craft experiences based on what we know about the customer. So you can say, we can target a majority of our customers, for example, within this XYZ demographic that tend to like warmer color palettes, and that sort of drives their conversion rates for some reason. And since we can find that sort of thing out, we can distill those assets and craft experiences around that. So really sort of giving us endless possibilities to really pinpoint what works best for that user and really sort of drive the experience to what they tend to do a lot. And really sort of what's great about this too, and it's just really sort of demonstrating all these possibilities within a constraint, because one of the great things about constraint is it actually breeds creativity. Constraints generally seen as something that's bad, but really if you're given a design system and that has brand guidelines, it takes a lot of creativity to apply those and then solve the problems with the assets that you're sort of given. And so this leads me into sort of talking about what is Theme Manager and how does it play a role within the Eden ecosystem. It is a Publicis Sapient open source design and developer tool that sort of distills existing design assets into data, specifically JSON. And the power of this is we can take this and serve this into different platforms such as web, mobile, design toolings like Adobe XD, Sketch, Figma, or whatever else comes along, as long as it sort of accepts JSON data. But even you can take JSON data and sort of mold it however you need to mold it. I think one thing that was mentioned in some previous talks within the XT Summit, I think one thing that was mentioned with computational design is your A/B test. And really that's sort of comparing a couple of things. But now really you have a infinity test, because you can sort of generate tons of different variations and be able to test those without having to individually create each one and be able to generate those things, sort of on the fly. And sort of because of that, we're able to, because we're distilling those assets into a consumable API, we can really sort of give you, whatever your heart desires to be able to craft those experiences. And so we're taking all of these, we're ingesting all of these theme attributes within the site CSS and sort of separating those out so that we can really sort of pinpoint what we need and what we may not need, and really sort of being able to give you sort of an unopinionated lens into a user's design system. So, and not only an unopinionated lens, but an immediate unopinionated lens. So this really sort of gives you an idea. Say, for example, if your system has too many colors in your CSS, we can give you that feedback right away. We can give you feedback around whether there are too many color scales that are being used, or if there's unapproved or outside the guidelines of font sizes and font faces. Then we can sort of give you an idea around, hey, you're not really following the guidelines that have been set within your design system, and really sort of, giving you that feedback. And you could also get the feedback that, hey, everybody's doing a great job, and, keep on keeping on. And sort of another pragmatic use that, sort of Theme Manager also helps with is helping a project get up and running between dev and design. Because in a lot of cases, as many times as we try to iterate and improve on, the handoff process between dev and design can be sometimes a little painful. And it's not so much that there's always a contentious relationship between dev and design, but really it's just sometimes design has to wait on clients to give their assets. Developers are waiting to get started with their project, and then sometimes you don't want to necessarily be twiddling your thumbs, and then everybody's like, design, where is our design? But if you're able to sort of start with a few basic components, scrape these sort of, scrape the client site and get their existing design assets, you can at least start with a low-level set of design tokens within a few seconds, essentially. And that is super powerful. So what I'll do now is I'll jump into the browser and give you a little bit of a live demo of thememanager.com. So super original name, thememanager.com. It doesn't have any cool name like some mythical creature, but it sort of tells you what it does, which is sometimes better than nothing. So when I first come in, I'm presented with sort of our Publicis Sapient data. So we've sort of cached this locally and just sort of giving you an idea into, sort of the capabilities and what we're showing. So what I can do is I'm actually going to log in here as a fancy dev and enter in my super secure password. And what I'll do is I will say xtsummit.com. And what this is doing in the moment is using an API to hit xtsummit.com, grab the CSS files, and then parse them all out. So as this is currently running, it's distilling all of those assets. And then we should start to see, there we go. So what it's done is it hit that API, scraped it, and then gave me sort of the CSS assets that are used within xtsummit.com. And you can see it's pretty good. It's pretty limited on sort of the color palette, a few brand reds, a couple other brand colors as well. And you can see it kind of doesn't do the best job at filtering out already mentioned assets, but we thought that was important because what this is really showing is if a code guidelines is stating that all colors must be used to 6 hash value, hex value, then this would actually be, this just using black is incorrect and just using hash 000 for a black is the same. Or it may demonstrate too that, like, for example, with these examples of white, we have essentially 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different definitions of white when really we should only be using one. And so then you could look at this and I could say, well, I don't like that. Let's go ahead and start removing things that are not really following our design guidelines. We can go ahead and tweak that a little bit. We also may say like, oh, this is kind of, this light blue is not really white. So let's go ahead and just edit this, make it blue as a hue, and then we can drag and drop that over here. And that's great. So one thing that we can sort of do with this is start to generate things, right? We can start to generate palettes because we have a bunch of assets. And what we're going to do is we're going to take these assets, set a couple parameters that we want to be able to follow, and then sort of give me a color mode. So what I'll do here is I'll set my contrast ratio for the sake of making it somewhat interesting. And then I will sort of tweak my primary color range and go and hit generate color mode. And that generates me a very simple color palette. I can come in here and I can tweak accordingly. And then I can also kind of keep doing that over and over again. And we're getting, sort of slightly different variations. And I can keep hitting these until I kind of start to iterate the same thing over and over again. In this case, it's not terribly interesting because there aren't a ton of choices on the color palette, but you can see that, maybe I like my accent color to be a little lighter or a little darker, and I can sort of look like, what's that going to look like in the browser? Because as great as browsers are, or excuse me, as designed tools are, they are not the browser. If I use another example of a music service, unnamed music service, who has a ton of palettes, colors in their color palette, I can start to generate more interesting sort of palettes. And this also is more of an extreme example of what this might look like, and then be able to assess and analyze what you're doing. But I can go ahead and hit, and then I start to get like different color modes as such. And then I can kind of tweak my hue again, give me the full range, but heavily saturated, and maybe something that's a little lighter. Go ahead and generate me something there. And now I have another color palette, given distilling used all the distilled colors that are used above. And that's super, super powerful. So what I'm actually going to do is flip back to XT Summits and then load that. All right, so now we're back to where we started. We have our color modes that are already saved and stored in a Couchbase server. In this case, there's no gradients, but theoretically here you would see your CSS gradients used. Then we use, sort of have your typography tools that show sort of parse all of the instances that your font size is set to on all the values that are used to set that. And then you can sort of remove and add whatever you need to. We do the same thing with font face, line height, font weights, text shadows, text width. In this case, if you're curious about sort of what a text width is when you have a full responsive site, sometimes on larger screens you do not want your max width to exceed a certain amount. Then it makes the reading experience tough. So sometimes if something's not distilled, we'll have some recommendations in here. But what's great about all this, similar to color modes, is now we have this text element styles. And sort of what we'd like to iterate on later is actually not have it be specifically tied to HTML elements, because when you sort of create your text styles, you don't necessarily want to have them be tied to semantics. You want them to be independent, because if you want to style an H3 like an H1 for whatever reason, you have the freedom to do that, and that your semantics are not tied to your style. So that way you have that sort of flexibility, and you're not having to misuse header levels, for example, just because you want a specific style within your site. But because similar to color modes, we can start to create different heading styles based on whatever I've sort of distilled already, and I can sort of build that out. This was sort of an idea that came out talking to a distinguished colleague who's a designer on the Walmart account. They had sort of the ideas like, hey, I wanted, like color modes, I want to distill this into like text element styles. Let me sort of see what it looks like in the browser, because like mentioned before, I want to see what it looks like in the browser, because again, design tools, as great as they are not the browser. And I could also look at this in different browsers if I wanted to and get an idea of what that looks like. But I can go and sort of create different versions of it. I can, sort of generate, if I feel like doing, actually, let's do this a little better and say I want really big. And I could sort of look at that, maybe make this a little tighter example, and then maybe super bold. So that, it gives you an idea of like all of these possibilities and all of these assets that are in these drop downs. While, in this case, it's pretty manageable. In some cases where you have a lot of different color assets or font weights, families, etc., it would be a little more difficult to sort of go through. But this gives you a good idea. It's like we can grab anything that we want out of this and start using it right away and use it in a context that's showing. You may see a little sort of something flying back and forth, and that's sort of a save state, because when we make a change, it saves it to the Couchbase server. So similar to some of the other things, we have our spacing, and we sort of show you all the spacing values. We're tying together margins and paddings, because really they should use the same scale to help with your vertical rhythm. We also give you a nice little visual here on the right. And if I wanted to look at something that was a little nicer, I can do so and generate myself something a little curved, and then I can sort of go in and tweak those accordingly. And it follows a nice, much more better rhythm vertically. So we do these things like that for borders, radius, and sort of helping with our spacing, border widths, and, sort of on, and basically just about any asset that we can sort of contribute, including motion. So I'm going to go ahead and keep scrolling down here. Also, we do breakpoints. Also gives you an idea of, hey, maybe we're not really approaching mobile first, and we should be really making sure that when we write our media queries, we should be using min width, and that's about it. And not trying to constrain between min and max width, and really be able to use cascading style sheets and only use, for example, I only want to use 600, maybe 700, and etc. All right, so another powerful point of this is because we're distilling all this in JSON, we can start to mold this data into something that's usable into my project right away. Like I said, what we're doing is we're just saving, your basic key value relationship that has a somewhat of a design token-esque structure. But what this allows us to do is to start to create different variables and different classes. For example, I can create CSS classes based off all of those assets, and it's distilling what we've done all above into these sections of different data. And I'll get into some of these a little bit later, but it really sort of gives us an idea into, say there's another technique that comes down the road, we can take the same data and then iterate on it. Another example was talking to some of our other colleagues is that we were showing this to is like, hey, I'm looking for something that's, we use a lot of single-use classes. So they do, single-use classes being, it does one thing and does it very well. So for example, if I just want to set a font size, I can just add those classes, font size, and I can do that. So we can create single-use classes, so we can do that in like an hour or so. The same thing with CSS variables. I can do that. We can also do these things with design tokens, for example, and create sort of that tier one, use context, and really sort of just distilling values. And on top of that, we can actually create different exports for theming for different frameworks, for example. So you have the Flutter mobile language, which is generally used for rapid development on mobile devices, but it has other applications as well, and it expects data in sort of a different way. So what we did here is create a map, which is essentially like a JavaScript object that, similar to TypeScript, also holds you to types a little bit better. a little stronger typing as well, compared to sort of vanilla JavaScript, where it has sort of, but it also has like a key value pairing. So this allows us to be able to, be able to create those references within our Flutter code. So that is sort of like the core, functionality of Theme Manager. But we have these other offshoots too, and I'll only highlight a couple. For example, stats, and we're giving you sort of an insight onto what that looks like. I'm going to actually pull up this music agency again, or service, and this is showing again, here are all the accessible color combinations. One color is your background, one is your foreground, and sort of going through all of those and iterating it. We want to show some distribution against your hue. What's that look like? Same with brightness, saturation, sort of giving you a more visual representation of different aspects within your design assets. Then we borrowed a couple things from CSSstats.com. Adam is and might still be. Adam Morris is still a contributor to CSSstats.com, an originator. So, some of his influence and recommendations here can kind of be seen. So we have the specificity graph, which gives you an idea of how well you're doing on your CSS selectors. So the x-axis from left to right is your line numbers, and then the scores, score is basically calculated on different weights given to, if I use an ID selector, if I use a pseudo element, if I use different joins for parent-child relationships, if I use how many classes I'm using, if I'm using important, and those sort of things. And generally, you want to kind of follow this blue line where it's kind of exponential, and as you go down your page, you're becoming more specific, and you're being a little more dry in the sense of you're not repeating yourself. And in this case, we're not doing the best job here, or they're not doing the best job here, and maybe overriding themselves. We also give a little more insights on what those, compared to some popular CSS frameworks, another visual representation of what your font size scale may look like, how big your CSS is, and we also compare that to some more popular CSS frameworks. A couple other little things. And one thing I actually find like the most useful insight into my CSS or somebody else's CSS, prospective client CSS, is how many times we're mentioning classes and elements. So this will give me an idea of, hey, maybe we're creating too many variations of an anchor element, or maybe we should be using button more often, depending on how we're styling those things. But it kind of gives us an idea of, hey, 538 mentions of my anchor tag is a lot. Maybe I'm overriding my anchor tag styles too often, or I'm having to include my wrap because maybe down the line, or in my CSS, things are becoming a little more specific early on, and I'm having to override things over and over again. So it just gives you a little insight in what that looks like. One powerful thing about all of this is because we're distilling all of these design assets, we can start to theme against different UI frameworks. So what's really great too is we can take all of these values, all these colors are coming from our color palette again, and we can start to generate different palettes. And this is actually specific to a React UI framework called Material UI. It also follows the Google Material UI, and I can start to set different ratios and start to generate palettes, and I can go in here and edit accordingly if I need to. But what we're doing is we're not now starting to show you in the context of the browser all these different properties that allow us to sort of iterate and preview what it looks like without having to go in and skin things throughout my application. And I can sort of start to design and say, like, what's going to look good. Maybe I want to recommend that most of our buttons should be using our secondary color, whatever our default, quote unquote, color is, default being default to the framework. We want our different sizes to be, we can sort of iterate along this and get a good idea of what it's going to look like in the browser with the parameters that are already available to me. And this gives us a super powerful look into that. And we can do it, and because, again, this is all super extensible, we can start to say, awesome, let's go ahead and build this for our specific project, like a Bootstrap or whatever XYZ framework comes down the line. And we give a couple options here in this material UI, specifically where it gives you sort of a basic option of just show me right away, and I can keep hitting generate palette, and sort of what that looks like by default and how things are applied based on that palette. And what's also great about that is now I can say, I don't want to just keep hitting generate palette over and over again. Let me go ahead and say, let's generate 24 variations that have kind of followed your AAA contrast ratio that fit within a certain hue. Say if I have a brand color for my primary that I like to follow, I can start to, kind of tweak that accordingly. I can tweak my saturation and my lightness and go ahead and hit generate. And what that's doing is generating all these possibilities that follow sort of a fairly basic algorithm of, based on the parameters that we're passing to it, to generate me over and over again different color combinations. So I'm able to iterate super, super fast on the possibilities based on the palette that I have. And I can go in as a designer, for example, and look at, this is a good starting point. Let me go ahead and click this apply button. Now I've applied that palette to the application's framework, and then I can start to go in and tweak it accordingly. And I can keep doing this over and over again. Maybe I just want to start all over again, or go back into your bulk editor again and say, maybe that's not enough. Let me get, 60, for example. I may get a little bogged down, but we'll go ahead and generate it anyways. So it'll take a few seconds, and now I have 60 variations with all of these color combinations, and I can just look through all of those and choose one and then iterate on that again. So it's really sort of like you're really leveraging that agile principle of agile design, development of iterating over and over and over again quickly. And this tool sort of allows you to do that. And then I can sort of hit export theme. That'll download a JSON file that I can import into my framework code and be off and running. All right, so let me bounce back to XT Summit again. Again, very limited palette, but what I'll do here is hit Diffie. So Diffie is a great tool. I would consider it in a alpha state because it's very basic in sort of what it can do. But essentially what it does is you basically have, similar to the way your versioning control, whether it be SVN or Git, does a compare when you do a pull request and say, here's my changes, my left and right sort of, comparison, and then it may show an intersection as well. So what we're doing here is allowing us to, there's a couple applications that we can sort of use this towards. One would be, say I distill all these assets and I save that as sort of like my starting point. And then what I could do is I can sort of go in and create another copy of that. I can pull those assets again and then tweak that and then compare and contrast against different states of my design assets. So I can say, for example, if I'm looking at a prospective client, like here's what we can do, and here's what we did in an hour or two. We've pulled down your assets, and we've cleaned up essentially what you have based on your CSS and what we think you should be able to use and should only be using based on your design guidelines, and then be able to preview that. Another thing you can do is do a check against multiple sites. So for example, if I have multiple products or multiple sites that should be following the same design system, I can go ahead and run that against that. So for example, I've distilled 2 government agencies, the US government agencies. US government has a design system that is supposed to be used throughout the agencies, but like some governments, maybe we don't always follow the rules or follow the protocols. So let me go ahead and hit run compare. And what this is showing me is here on the left is my original, and really should be left intersection right versus sort of original and current. But when we first did that, that's sort of where we ended up. But what I have here on the left is like, here's what's unique to this original US government agency. On the right, I have for this other, another US government agency, what's unique to them. And then in the middle, like what overlaps or intersects in this case. So you can sort of see it's very rudimentary. And we just are really doing a straight compare and contrast in sort of what that looks like. And, it's fairly basic in that sense. And you have three options in which you can sort of pull that through. The URLs, like if I wanted to pull in another government agency that I haven't distilled yet, I can do that. The file is, so we have an option to download the file, this JSON object or JS file that's sort of saved here. Where did I put that? There's a download button at the bottom of the page. So there's like a JS file, theme.js file, which is really sort of what this raw JSON file is here. And then you can re-upload it in case you want to share it in some sort of cloud platform. But that's sort of it. So that in a nutshell, in sort of a roundabout way, is theme managers. There's obviously much more we can do with this. There's so many applications that we can do with this. So here's a couple of resources. Like I said, this is an open source project within Publicis Sapient, meaning that you as a Publicis Sapient colleague can contribute to this right away. It's not necessarily open sense in a traditional sense where anybody outside of the organization can contribute to this project, because there is some Publicis Sapient IP with this. But it's sort of ready for you to contribute to this. There is a link for the code repos. It's up on our PS Cloud or Line Cloud for GitLab. There's two Microsoft Teams that I employ you to join. Eden, which is more specific to the Eden project, and computational design, in case you have a passion for computational design. It's just really a lot of people that are interested in making art with code. There's also a presentation that was given to John Maeda, where gives a deeper background on how Eden kind of came about. And then on the right, you have ways you can sort of get in touch with me, whether it be by email, Twitter, or Teams. Feel free to contribute in any manner. And with that, thank you so much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. All right, take care. Bye.